Right, probably looks like I've just murdered some trees, but that's not actually the case. Let's have a closer look. What I've done then is coppice them. And what is coppicing? Well, as any gardener would tell you, there's two ways of pruning a plant. You either prune it in the winter for vigour, or you prune it in the summer to control its growth. So it's winter time, just about, and what I'm effectively doing is pruning these trees. Now come back stronger than ever. So there's the trees I've just felled, and over here, just on the edge of the trees, that's something I coppiced a couple of years ago. Hopefully you can see here, this would have been one tree. So I cut it off, and then from the stump it sprouted up. How many we've got here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, about seven main stools have popped back up again. And then in another 5 years or so, I'll cut all of those down, and it will just carry on like that. And that way the tree can live for hundreds of years. The stump gets bigger and bigger, but none of the individual stools that come up are ever going to get more than manageable size. Here's some more examples that are a few years old. Well, I cut down a few years ago rather. So you can see this great big mass of ash that's popped back up again. And here again you can see in here all this regrowth, and then same again here, all this regrowth. So both this and this would have been individual trees when I chopped them down about 4 years ago. So that coppicing process then is how I manage most of my trees. Normally with coppicing you have an area that you completely clear fell, and that's called a cant. So your woodland would be divided up into cants, and you take out one each season and work your way around in a rotation. Here I don't really have enough woodland to be able to do that, and it's not a formal coppice anyway. Most of these trees are just self-seeded. It wasn't until I turned up and started planting some, which you'll see in a minute, that there was any kind of planning went on here. So the way I do it is to take out a scallop into the woodland. Here for instance then, where I've just chopped down these 3 trees, I'll work my way right up the hill, right up through this lot, up to the top of this slope, which is just there. What that does is it takes out a big area all at once and then lets the light into that area, and then you get lots of regrowth in that bit. In some places I take out individual trees, so that's just thinning, and I'll take a tree out and the other trees around it will be able to increase their canopies to fill that gap. And that's what I do if there's a lot of crowding going on. When I first got here there was a whole stand of oaks, self-seeded oaks, that were very tightly together and they were really struggling, so I thinned them out a lot, and that provided me loads of firewood, and eventually the remaining trees were much more healthy. Not all trees cope well with the coppicing process. In fact, if you chop down a beech tree, and generally you're going to have to plant another one because that's a goner. I've been lucky here that most of the trees that I have respond very well to it. So I've got lots of ash, what would be the best ones? Ash, hazel and hawthorn. They all spring back very well. The oak does quite well, but it's so slow growing that it's not really, you definitely wouldn't plant it as a coppice. As far as the tree harvest goes then, this is very much the busiest time of the year. I could have done this work at any point over the winter. It needs to be done during the winter because the trees are dormant then and the sap is all down in the roots. As you get into springtime, that sap rises as the trees prepare to stick out some leaves, and then that means if you cut down a tree when it's full of sap, it's going to be an extra year to season it, apart from anything else. I mean, the other problem if you chop down a tree in the summertime is, one, it's not going to regenerate because it's spent all its energy in growing in that growing season, and for 2, you're going to have loads of foliage on the tree getting in your way. Oh, and especially there'll probably be nesting birds in it as well, so it's all round bad idea. It's very much a winter task. Had the weather been more conducive, I'd have done this months ago, but it wasn't. It was another soggy winter, and as you've probably seen in other videos, I had my hands full just sliding around in the mud and yeah, fooling about with vehicles. Each year as I get ever feebler, I have to think of more ways of becoming more efficient in my management of the woodland. And so a couple of years ago I bought this little tractor, which works great as a kind of mobility scooter come petrol powered wheelbarrow. Last year, when the big tractor was out of action, the little tractor did nearly all the haulage. I was using the little tractor to go into the woods, bring out the wood, and then I was putting it in these crates which I had in a long line and they went in the crates to season. This year, because the big tractor is fixed, I've been able to bring the crates out to where I'm working. So those trees that you just saw me fell, I'll be able to process those right here on the spot, and all the firewood will go into these crates. Anything that's smaller than that, so let's look down here. Here's one of the trees I've just felled. This will all be firewood, so I'll chop that up here. And then as you get into the top bit of it, this smaller stuff, this will go for charcoal. And then what I plan to do is use all the brush, so the really thin stuff here, to power the charcoal process. This way all of the wood will get used. It'll all have some purpose. Some people have said that I should be using just dead wood. That's not actually as good an idea as it sounds. For one, dead wood tends to be rotten, but mainly because dead wood is full of life, it's full of bugs, and it's actually, if you have standing dead wood or lying dead wood, it's best to leave it there. It's a really good habitat. Now, when I used to do tree work for a living, as I was a conservation worker when I was a youngster, we used to stack wood as actual habitat piles. So I tend to do that here as well. If I've got brush and it's too difficult to get where I want to be making the charcoal, I'll just stack that brush and it'll rot down and it'll be a habitat pile on its own. What you're looking at here is a future coppice. This is 120 trees that I planted quite a few years ago now. They alternate between ash and hazel. So the ash was self-seeded that I dug up from around here, and the hazel I bought in. And so they alternate. There's 4 rows of them, and they go ash, hazel all along. And the reason I planted ash and hazel is they work very well together, because ash tends to grow up and it's very sparse in its foliage. Hazel tends to grow outwards, and that'll be particularly the case once they're all coppiced. They'll do that, and yeah, that's a good way of getting the maximum out of it. So this is what you call a short rotation coppice. This would be on something like a 7-year cycle. One thing I hear quite frequently is that I must be loaded to afford all this kit. If you knew me at all, you'd know that's really not the case. Everything here has always been run on an absolute shoestring. The way I do it is to spend ages looking for things, and then at some point someone will either give it to you, or you'll come across a bargain, or you'll find something that's absolutely knackered that you can do up. And that was the case with this tiny tractor, for instance. So £200 I paid for this, and it does all the mowing here. The best thing about it is it can collect. It's got a powered sweeper collector, and as I'm becoming too feeble to actually rake anymore, that's an absolute godsend. The fact that it'll tow a little trailer, that's all just bonus. But I got that so cheaply because that was given in as part exchange at the mower dealers, and the mower dealer didn't want to sell it on as a warranted item because he didn't think it would be reliable enough. So I got it as a non-runner. I fixed the fuel pump. I think it was just the fuel pump. I think I might change the plugs, and I think I even changed the oil actually. And then it was up and running again. So there we go. Same with the big tractor. I paid £850 for the big tractor in kind of running condition. I used it at work when I had the workshop in town. I used it there for years until it just got weaker and weaker. I brought it back here and it lasted a few more months before it just died. So £850 I spent on a tractor that was just on the verge of absolute dereliction, and last year I rebuilt the engine and then it's back up and running again. So what I'm trying to say is you don't necessarily have to spend a lot of money to get a lot of kit, but if you don't spend the money, you're definitely going to have to spend the time fixing it, and that seems to be what I spend a lot of my life doing. That's okay. That's okay if you're not in a hurry, that's fine. I'm not going to talk at great length about what kit to have because it's quite a personal choice really. I'll just go over what works for me. So I would consider a forestry helmet with built-in ear defenders and a mesh guard. Well, this one's seen better days. I'd consider that to be an absolute essential. Also a good pair of rigger boots, at least, if not chainsaw boots, I'd consider to be an essential. Gloves are not really relevant because you've always got your hands well away from the blade. You might happen to notice I'm wearing a dashing pair of dungaree salopette thingies. These have got a wire mesh lining end which is supposed to catch a chain if it goes down into my leg. I consider these optional. I bought these because they were £15. I got them at a factory clearance, so that's great. But I've managed without for the last 20 years, so yeah, an optional extra really. They are good for stopping you being stabbed by the thorns, I'll give them that much. Onto the saws then. So this is one of my favourite bits of kit. This is a Husqvarna, what's it, 61 it says there. This saw is very old, it's very heavy, it's also very powerful, and I do love it. Unfortunately, I'm only able to use it, I mean, a few years ago I had to accept the fact that I can only use this for about 10 minutes before I'm suffering. So then I went out and bought this one, and I bought this new. This is one of the smallest professional Husqvarnas that you can get. This is a brilliant bit of kit. I really like this. This is a 135, this is called. Until very recently it had a 14-inch blade on it, so it came out to about there, and I've just a week or two ago changed it down to a 12-inch, and it's absolutely transformed the saw, because it's like changing the gearing on a bicycle, or I suppose, because it's a smaller bar now, it goes around that much quicker. It's also a bit lighter because it doesn't have that weight out to the tip, and I find I can use it one-handed if I want to. Well, that's probably not recommended, but there you go. Some of you then might be wondering what's actually wrong with me, why do I keep moaning on so much about being feeble. Well, I've got basically my innards are kind of twisted and not quite right. It's probably the easiest way of putting it. It doesn't really affect me in day-to-day life if I keep a lid on what I do. For instance, with the chainsawing, using the big saw, it's the lifting and twisting that I have trouble with. I also have trouble with like raking and digging in the garden. So all these things I can work around if I plan ahead a bit. And for instance, now with the chainsawing, what I do is fill up the saw with fuel, and I limit myself to that tank of fuel, and then I'm good. If I do just that in a day, I can do the next day as well, and so on and so on. While we're at it then, we'll go down the hill and I'll show you some of the other bits where I've been working, and some of the other ways in which I'm managing this tiny little bit of woodland. What I've been doing here is stacking brush against the hedge, and I'll come along later and process that. And I've been stacking cordwood in heaps on this side of the track. We've got that cage then ready to be filled with the cordwood that's stacked in front of it, and then I'll bring that cage up here and process these stacks of cordwood in there, put those in there as well. And on the other side here I've got a load of brush waiting to be processed. What I'm going to do this year is bring my charcoal kiln down, and I'll put it somewhere down in this corner. That's where lots of this brash will end up. We'll be fueling the kiln. There'll be videos of all that once I rebuild the kiln, or videos of me rebuilding the kiln, I guess. It's quite an interesting setup. Lots of my landing is very steep and not really even walkable on. Let's go up and have a closer look at what I was doing yesterday. I'm not sure it comes across on camera just how steep this bit is. it is. You can't walk on it unaided, put it that way. Anyway, here we've got a hazel tree, or possibly even a couple of them. And again, it was just an absolute mess of overgrown stools. And I've cut all that back. I've also, behind me, cut all the hawthorn that was competing with that hazel. And so I've taken out a whole section, and the light will get in onto these stumps and they'll sprout back up like mad. So behind me you should be able to see a hedge that I planted maybe 5-6 years ago, something like that. It's actually taken really well. Last year I cut it right down to chest height, all the way down. This goes all the way down one side of the land, and it sprouted back up massively. This winter I haven't cut it at all, because I read somewhere that if you cut it every other year you'll get more flowering and berries on there, which is what I'm after. There was no hedge at all here before. There was just a fence between my bit of land and the neighbouring farm, and loads of brambles, just a massive amount of brambles, and that did as a hedge for a long time. And one year we had heavy snow, and the heavy snow squashed the bramble hedge, and when I woke up in the morning the dog had wandered off. The dog never ran away, but he'd wander, and then he'd wander a bit more, and then he'd be lost. Oh, it's a great dog. I miss dog. I'd say there's probably 2 or 3 acres here. It's kind of hard to quantify because you've seen some of the terrain. But yeah, a fairly minimal amount, and it's not like it's a proper plantation or anything like that, and there's not any super big trees here really. But I would say at least 2/3 to 3/4 of the wood that I burn comes from this woodland, and the rest I get from external sources. People tend to give it to me, or I trade work for the wood or whatever. But it's all manageable, and it works for me. If I had to buy in wood, yeah, I'd think about something else. Yeah, I'd do everything differently. To be honest, if I was to rebuild the barn or build another house, I would super insulate it. I mean, it is insulated, it's got quite a lot of insulation, but I would go overboard of insulation, because insulation is one of those things. It's like buying the land in the first place. You pay ahead and then you save later, but the ongoing maintenance of looking after the trees and processing the wood and using the wood, I don't mind. I actually quite enjoy that. It's one of the things I like, and I intend to do it for as long as I can physically manage to. So there we go. So we're standing on the grassy bit here, and then I've taken out a scallop going right up to the top of this sort of cliff bit. One of the things that does, apart from let the light in and regenerate this section, is to create more margins. And one thing I learned when I was doing conservation work was that lots of the interesting stuff when it comes to biodiversity goes on the margin between the grassland and the forestry. This is why hedgerows are so important. Proper hedgerows, I mean, not monoculture hedgerows. So now what I've done there, that will generate that sort of fringe area before the ash re-establishes itself and turns it back into forestry again. So best practice is to chop down a tree, process it and chop down the next tree. It's not really what I've done here, but because it's coming right to the end of the season, the priority for me is to get the trees down. So every tree I was dropping, I was then cutting the stump, so that tree's now ready to regenerate. The tidying up bit can be done over the next few weeks. So there we go. So the next time you see somebody busily working away in a woodland, it might not be murder, it might be management. So I am actually looking after it. It's a harvest, and I look after the woodland, and that's how, despite having such a minuscule amount of woodland, it's produced the bulk of my fuel for each winter for the last, was it 13 or 14 years. So there you go. Thanks for watching. Cheers.